Last season, Bungie introduced 3 new strand aspects. The Titan one was pretty good, the other 2 were okay. I could fit it all into one video. This season's aspects are much more substantial, to the point where I may have individual videos for all of them, and we're starting with one of the craziest additions to the game in Titan's Banner of War aspect. In order to get this aspect, go to Nimbus on Neptune, who will send you to Veil Containment in the bottom left side of your screen. Activate the terminal, and the quest should complete pretty quickly, then go back to the Puka Pond on Neomuna to get the aspect. Banner of War does the following. Defeating a target with a melee, finisher, or sword raises a Banner of War that pulses, periodically healing yourself and nearby allies, while also increasing melee damage by 40% and sword damage by 10%. Targets defeated by yourself or nearby allies charge the banner, increasing the speed of its pulses. Now, it's not the fact that this aspect exists that I believe this is a strong thing to have in the game. It's the fact that this aspect exists in addition to the fact that Titans are nearly immortal with Woven Mail, and now I'm not sure how to die anymore. You have Woven Mail, already massive damage reduction. You have Sever, which just got buffed this season to make enemies deal 40% less damage to you. And now you have an effect that caps out at 30 seconds but can still be refreshed, that pulses every second at maximum stacks, 4 stacks, which heals you. And with another thing that we'll talk about, after testing it, I did not even need to monitor my health because I knew that I would pretty much never die. What I like about Banner of War, besides the fact that it's, really good, is the fact that there are a bunch of variant builds that can use Banner of War. Usually I like to stick to 1 or 2 things, but there are so many possibilities here that I think I'm only going to scratch the surface. I'm definitely not going to talk about every single possibility. For the first time since Strand was introduced, I rotated off of Into the Fray for some testing. Into the Fray is still phenomenal, being able to give yourself Woven Mail via Tangles, which also got buffed in that the cooldown to make a tangle is now shorter this season, not to mention the melee regeneration bonus when you have Woven Mail. It meshes perfectly with Flechette Storm, last season's aspect, and last season I discussed a Heart of Inmost Light build. We are essentially taking that build and morphing it to be Banner of War friendly, boosting our melee damage and giving us even more survivability via healing, probably Strand's only significant weakness. However, important to note that Flechette Storm, while fun, is replaceable. It adds range to your build when you want it, which is good, but there is nothing wrong with using the default melee attack, especially since, again, Sever got a buff this season, which the default melee attack applies. But I want to try out some new stuff, so Flechette stays for the time being. The fragments I'm using are Warding, Fury, Transmutation, and Generation. Warding is now our only way of getting Woven Mail if we're using Flechette Storm, so make sure you're paying attention to Orbs of Power much more often if you take Flechette. Transmutation is going to provide tangles more or less on cooldown. Fury gives us melee energy when we use those tangles, and Generation is just more grenade energy. Although since it did get nerfed, if you wanted to rotate this out for something else, I think that's okay, especially since we're going to be on Heart of Inmost Light, which is generating a lot of energy anyway. You could probably rotate out Transmutation too, depending on what you're doing. If you plan on using strand weapons, Propagation is an easy thing to pick. I think Isolation to plant Sever on priority targets isn't the worst idea either if you plan on using Flechette Storm more often than the default melee. When it comes to Shackle Grenade versus Grapple, I think this is personal preference. Obviously, Grapple is going to give you considerably more offensive power than Shackle is, but I like having Shackle around as a little, oh crap button. Feel free to use either one. I'll give a quick refresher on how to play this build, for those maybe not experienced, but you essentially just want to follow the rules of Heart of Inmost Light. Use an ability to boost the other 2. You want to weave your abilities as much as you can, class ability, grenade, melee, so that the other 2 abilities are always boosted to their maximum, which is 2 stacks. This increases their recharge rate as well as their potency. Given this build, I would definitely try to use your abilities in a way where your melee is at X2 potency as often as possible, which usually means using your other two abilities first. This is a very different playstyle to your typical run and gun. You need to keep tabs on way more buffs and cooldowns than usual, but once you get some practice in, it's really satisfying to use. Much like last season, this build is very heavy on ability spam. It's very fun. There's not too much downtime between abilities as long as you're comboing out. It doesn't play too differently compared to the previous 2 times I've discussed this build either. It performs around the same that it did back in Season 21, where it's something I'm using in slightly more casual content, seasonal content, stuff like that. I think Tier 2 Altars of Summoning is the perfect spot for this build. It again does fine in stuff like Legend, solo Lost Sectors. This footage is of a Master Lost Sector. But if I really want to tackle those, I'm going to go with something that has much more champion disruption versus just pure slaying capabilities, because it is kind of hard to get things going the more difficult the content is if you're by yourself. One thing being discussed much more this season is Monte Carlo, mainly because of its catalyst where you can stab with the knife on the end of the gun, a much requested feature from the community. The catalyst melee does a lot of damage, but that's not really why I'm interested in the weapon. Monte Carlo has been the go-to weapon for any builds that are based on melee, because its main perk is a melee energy generation machine, giving you energy on hits and kills, occasionally restoring a full charge of melee on kill as well. I've never been the hugest fan of the weapon itself, but I cannot deny its power to make builds like this come to life. You can use the build without Monte Carlo. It is in no way mandatory for this specific setup, but it will help you fill in some gaps when it comes to your melee ability cooldowns. Alternatively, a weapon with Pugilist is a good backup, but you need kills to proc it, unlike Monte Carlo, which is hits or kills. But here is where we get to introduce a little bit of variance. Synthoceps are another exotic that I find pretty boring, but I will again not deny their strength. They drastically increase your melee and super damage when surrounded, which, given the season content during which this video is coming out, should be nearly all the time. In this case, you are trading out the spammy nature of the build for much more decisive moments of burst damage. I would probably encourage going back to Into the Fray versus Flechette Storm in this setup in higher difficulty content though. This is where I would also encourage Monte Carlo a bit more to keep uptime high, as Strand Titan melee is much more fun when you can use it more than one at a time. If you're okay without using Monte Carlo, then you can use something like Tractor Cannon, 1-2 Punch Shotgun to drop a ton of burst damage onto a target, spam all your melee charges, and then you super, and then you spam all your melee charges again. The drawback is that once this combo is over, you don't really have too many great ways of getting back to maximum power, getting all your ability charges back. This setup with Monte Carlo is a way of having a nice mix of gun-based combat and ability-based combat. You use all of your abilities, you back out, you restore your melee charges, and then you dive back in. This setup is also where I think you're going to find a lot more endgame success than the first version, because it's all about hitting hard, not hitting often. Synthoceps give you the damage boost that you need for your melee attacks to actually really hurt things like champions and bosses in endgame content. This footage is in a Master Nightfall, and when you can get both Banner of War and Synthoceps up and running, I mean, look at the damage. Banner X4 and Synthos are doing 69,000 damage per swing on a barrier champion I'm 21 levels under. Endgame is also where I'm really going to emphasize the fact that finishers get Banner of War rolling as well. A couple of finishers on some dinky enemies are going to get you up to speed pretty quickly, considering you can continue to boost Banner with any kind of kills once it's up and running. This performed much better than I thought it was going to, but it is not a build for the non-aggressive player. You need to be in the thick of it, but you also need to know when it's appropriate to be in the thick of it. Now we get to introduce even more variants, and this is truly some of the most ridiculous survivability that I think you can have in the game. Stronghold and Swords both have received significant updates over the past 2 seasons. Stronghold gives you restoration ×2 when you attack quickly after you're done blocking with a sword, with a duration based on how many shots you blocked. Sword guarding received a drastic increase in effectiveness in Season of the Witch, in between 82.5 and 95% reduction when guarding. You don't lose energy when guarding, you move faster when guarding, you don't need full energy to heavy attack, among a few other things. Stronghold maxes out your guard stat, so we're gaining the maximum power from guarding. That means, as a Strand Titan, you will have access to Woven Mail, Sword Guarding at 95% damage reduction, Banner of War healing you every second, and Restoration ×2 on occasion, all at the same time. We were already so hard to kill. Now? Forget it. Forget it. You can use a Strand Sword to get more Strand-specific benefits. You can use the Lament to get more damage and healing during actual sword use, although you mainly use the Lament's guard feature to rev yourself up for more damage and not really for defensive purposes. Keep in mind, though, that if you use a heavy sword attack, you will not be able to block right away. Knowing when you can and can't heavy sword attack is going to be pretty important for this setup. This setup is definitely not the most complex to learn. You basically want to block as you approach your targets or have a big attack coming your way, block as many shots as possible, and then attack right away to trigger Restoration from Stronghold and to start getting Banner of War going. Don't forget to pick up Orbs of Power for Woven Mail as well. The only things that I think are going to be able to actually kill you are Barrier Cabal Colossus and Unstoppable Ogres, and that's if you're just standing there doing nothing. This is absolutely endgame viable as well. Swords are a very viable endgame weapon, and if there is one place where all of this survivability is justified, it's endgame. However, as a non-Stronghold, not the most enthusiastic sword user, the main fault that I thought this build would have was ammo. Double special loadouts were finally fixed in that they no longer drop more power ammo than any other setup. With this build, while you have sword ammo, you are God. But if you can't get any sword ammo to drop, you are just some guy looking for power ammo. And that full investment to me lends itself to a playstyle where I only want to use a sword, and that's it. And that is simply not feasible. This led me wanting to partially spec into strength so I can flex some of my melee chops. You just don't have an exotic to help you in that case, an exotic armor piece. Heart of Inmost Light, Synthoceps, Stronghold, Monte Carlo, no Monte Carlo. There are so many adjustments you can make to this setup to fit whatever you're in the mood for or whatever content you're doing. I didn't even talk about glaives the entire time in this video. You think 95% reduction is good? How about glaive block, Vex Caliber, edge of action to make overshield bubbles too? I didn't talk about Worm God either. Strand Titan continues to be one of the most versatile and strongest subclasses in the entire game. And if you have not messed around with it too much just yet, I really encourage it, especially since we have a couple of Tangle-based perks in the artifact this season. This was a pretty high-level overview of Banner of War. I'm sure some of you out there have more specific things that you'd like to run, more specific fragments, weapons, mods, whatever. So feel free to drop some more knowledge in the comments. Share the wealth here. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you next time.